So Biden's been in office 21 months, and there has not been one thing that I can find, and I looked, that he's improved in our country. Nothing. Okay, so he took over, inflation was 1.3%, and is now approaching 9%. I mean, that's a disaster. And every one of us are subject to those higher prices, of course. Now, if my prediction is true and the Republicans win the House and the Senate, but even if they just win the House, then that will paralyze Joe Biden's next 2 years in office. He won't get any legislation passed at all unless there's a miracle conversion and he starts seeing the country in a problem-solving way, which of course he isn't. So it's over for Biden come November 8th. Now, it takes about a month and a half to transition from the old Congress to the new Congress, but by the end of January next year, you know, Biden is just going to sit there. He only sits there now, so, but, you know, nothing is going to get done, passed, or anything like that. So you say, well, he'll veto all Republican legislation. Yeah, he will. He will. But at least the country will see, hopefully, the Republican problem-solving abilities, if there are any. I mean, this Republican Party is not an actual, I mean, they're dubious. Word of the day, dubious. But maybe they have something. We'll see, right? And Biden can also issue executive orders, but the game now is the second he signs it, there's a federal lawsuit. And the federal courts are not friendly to Joe Biden anymore. They're not. They know what's happening here in America. So let's get to the history part. Right now, in my opinion, Joe Biden is the second worst president ever to serve in 21 months in office. The second worst. The first worst was our pal James Buchanan, the nation's first gay president. There's Jimmy. Pennsylvanian. He 15th president of the United States. Before that, he was Secretary of State. He was preceded by Franklin Pierce, another awful president. And then Lincoln came in after Buchanan was booted out of there in 4 years because he was so terrible. Why was he terrible? Okay. If you read Killing Lincoln, and I hope you do, that's the first Killing book, the nation was fracturing long before the Civil War broke out. It was fracturing way back into Andrew Jackson days in the 1820s, 30 years. It was fracturing because people in the North didn't believe in slavery, and it was a manufacturing economy. So New England, New York, Pennsylvania didn't believe in slavery and didn't need slavery because they were manufacturing things in plants. The South was an agrarian economy. They grew things. And the more money they made, okay, the more slaves they wanted because slaves were free labor. Free. And some of the slave owners were brutal. The slaves had no rights. They could be beaten. They could be murdered. Nobody's going to do anything about it. So the people in the North said, this is an abomination, particularly if you were a Christian. All right? You can't do this. But the South was dominated by the big plantation owners. It wasn't so much the regular Southerners, they didn't have slaves. They couldn't afford them. I mean, slaves were expensive. If you go to Charleston today, you can see the slave market. I mean, you got to have a lot of money to get a slave. And the slavery upped the profits of tobacco, cotton, whatever was being grown in the South because you didn't have to pay labor. So anyway, the South dug in. The plantation owners who controlled the states dug in with the help of villains like John Calhoun, these kinds of people. And they said, hey, you want to do away with slavery? You do away with us. We don't want to be a part of America anymore. Now that movement, as I said, that was in play in the 1820s. And Jackson wouldn't, even though Jackson was a Southerner, Andrew Jackson, he didn't have patience for that. So you get out of line, Jackson sent federal troops in and put you right back in line. But under Buchanan and Pierce before him, the Southerners started to raid Union depots and steal weapons and openly defy the government in Washington. And this went on for 10 years, but it reached a crescendo when Buchanan took office in 1857. And Buchanan just sat there because he wasn't really an abolitionist. He didn't care about slavery. He's from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a free state, but to him, I mean, he had other things on his mind. Put his picture back up there. He was what they called back then a dandy, okay? Never married, had a relationship with a Alabama senator, and they lived together, these guys. His niece ran the White House. And this guy was just, it was nothing good about him. And I'm not talking about his private life. He just couldn't govern. He just couldn't. So when he got booted out and Abraham Lincoln came in, Lincoln, a hell of a mess. All right, and it was just months before Fort Sumter and the Civil War started. So nobody's ever going to top Buchanan as worst president ever. Second worst president was a guy who took over for Abraham Lincoln after Lincoln was assassinated, which is why killing Lincoln is so important if you want to understand this. So Andrew Johnson was former governor of Tennessee, an uneducated guy, tailor. He was a tailor, okay? Very slick politician, tells everybody what they want to hear. But after the Civil War was over, the federal government had to rebuild the South, and this guy booted it. He allowed all these horrible people to go down to the South and exploit not only blacks, but whites too. They called them copperheads. The Southern people call them copperheads. The Northern came down. They just wiped them out fiscally and every other way, abused them. And Johnson just So Johnson ultimately was impeached in the House, and in the Senate trial survived by one vote. That's it. One vote. But he was awful. The third worst president was Herbert Hoover. Now, Hoover was the 31st president. He gets into office in 1929, and the stock market collapses. Not his fault. He didn't have anything to do with that. Okay, so it was excess in the 1920s. It was speculation. People were running wild, borrowing money. And then when it all went south, they couldn't pay the money back, and the banks failed, and what happened. But the federal government back then, in 1929, no safety nets. If you were starving in the street, you died. It's like Mexico now. Mexico didn't have any safety net. Why do you think all Mexicans want to come here? Okay? So you're in trouble in Mexico, the government's not going to help you. That was the way it was in the USA back then. So people got thrown out of their homes. They couldn't afford food. There were bread lines. In Brooklyn, where my father lived, he used to tell me that outside his row house, where my grandparents lived, and he lived with his brother and sister, people were lined up at the local Catholic church to get fed. They didn't have any money to buy food. And you might have heard of the term Hoovervilles. These were people who were just homeless people. And they were living anywhere they could live, in shacks and shanties and all of that. Hoover sat there for 2 years and didn't do anything. He didn't mobilize anything. It just allowed the suffering to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And then Hoover would go, I don't know. And then FDR, of course, was elected. And FDR brought in the New Deal, which was a system that some people don't like, of the government assistance. Almost everywhere, government creating jobs, government doing this, government doing that. Okay, so just to recap, Buchanan worst, Biden second, Andrew Johnson third, Herbert Hoover fourth. You could flip Herbert Hoover and Andrew Johnson. Hoover was bad. It's like that. Okay, so wrapping up the talking points memo, why is Biden in this crew? Because Biden came in and created problems. Hoover didn't create the collapse of the stock market in 1929, the Great Depression. Biden created inflation by attacking the fossil fuel industry and then ordering trillions of dollars of money to be printed by the Treasury for his insane projects. Biden's infrastructure deal this, COVID deal that, we'll give this to you, this to that, massive spending, way out of control. So the combination of attacking the American oil industry and coal industry and fracking industry, attacking them, creating all kinds of regulations so they couldn't harvest the energy, right? And the printing of the money, which diminished the dollar as worth, okay, rocketed inflation. Biden did it alone. He did it. No Congress. They didn't vote for it. They voted for the stupid infrastructure bills, but it was way out of control till then. And that's the memo. Bill@BillO'Reilly.com. If you have comments, Bill@BillO'Reilly.com. Happy to hear them. And there were other very bad presidents. Carter was really bad. Okay? And I said Pierce was bad. Millard Fillmore. I mean, I think, I can't prove it. I think Warren Harding's wife poisoned him. I think so. I mean, these guys were really bad, but nobody knew because there wasn't any reportage.